Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Werner, the Executive Director of Penn's Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics. Welcome to today's seminar on drug pricing, policy, and politics. The costs of prescription drugs are a long-standing concern both on the Hill and in people's homes in the United States. The concern stems from the simple fact that drug costs are very high in this country. There was a recent survey that showed that almost a quarter of adults in the US have trouble paying for their prescription medications. And these prices are really much higher in the US than they are in other countries, with Americans paying more than $1,500 per person for prescription drugs. This cost is only going up, with the prices of brand name drugs increasing at rates that are far above inflation. And with the recent FDA approval of the new Alzheimer's disease drug, aducanumab, or Aduhelm, with its $56,000 price tag, these issues were brought once again to the forefront, highlighting the complicated interplay between prescription drug prices, access, and value. Not surprisingly, there's a strong interest in addressing high and rising costs of drugs in the US. And while the term bipartisan support is rarely heard these days, addressing prescription drug prices is one issue that continues to hold the attention of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. We've seen a flurry of legislative activities around drug pricing in Congress, and just last week with the Biden administration. There's no shortage of ideas about what to do. Some proposals give the federal government power to negotiate drug prices. Some suggest setting reference prices for drugs using what is paid in other countries. And some cap consumers' out-of-pocket costs in Medicare Part D. But any policy proposal is also accompanied by trade-offs that we may or may not be willing to make. For example, if we constrain drug prices today, will we sacrifice future innovation and drug development that could save lives down the road? So the question is not whether to address this issue, but how and at what cost. And today we are lucky to have a group of experts with us to talk about exactly that. So first we have Ben Ippolito, who is an economist and a senior fellow in the Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. His research focuses in part on pharmaceutical market regulation and the effect of healthcare costs on personal finances of Americans. We are also joined by Rachel Sachs, a law professor at Washington University in St. Louis. She's an expert on health policy, focusing on healthcare technology, innovation, and predominantly in the pharmaceutical market. And finally, we are joined by Mariana Sokol, who is on the faculty in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she focuses on improving pharmaceutical coverage and access to prescription drugs for individuals living with chronic conditions. So thanks all of you for joining us today. Mariana, I want to start with you, and I wondered if you could just give us a little bit of background about why drug pricing is such an important issue to tackle from your perspective.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's great to be here. And you already mentioned that, around 1 in every 4 Americans have trouble affording their drugs. And, drug prices are increasing both for payers and patients, but the problem of affordability is much more acute for patients. 1 in every 3 Americans who take prescription drugs, about 1 in every 3, have reported that in the last year they weren't able to take a prescribed drug as recommended because of the cost. So that means, splitting pills, skipping doses. It means just not taking a drug altogether. And, for these individuals, not only we're going to have worse health outcome as a result from these choices, we're also going to have an increased cost to us as a society and as a system, because, we are not going to be tackling symptoms. People can go to the emergency room for an exacerbation of their condition. So there's a wide array of things that comes together with not being able to afford a drug.
So there's a lot of policies out there right now. It's a pretty complex landscape. And so Rachel, I'm going to turn to you to hope that you can give us a little bit better of a lay of the land about what policies are out there, what the main purposes of them are, and how they differ from one another.
Sure. And as you said, it is a complex landscape. There's a lot of different proposals out there. I tend to think of them as being in 3 different types of categories. So the first category is really targeted at the problem that Mariana is mentioned, the problem of patients' high out-of-pocket costs. And so you can think about HR3. This is the House Democrats' primary drug pricing vehicle, but not the only one on the table. That would set a $2,000 out-of-pocket cap for patients in Medicare Part D for the very first time. But the bipartisan Senate Finance Committee package from 2019 would have set that at $3,100. So there's a lot of bipartisan support for this aspect of things. Another bucket is to think about proposals that would discourage bad incentives in the system. And there's a lot of these, but one of the more notable policy options on the table, which is both in the Democratic package and the Senate Finance Committee package, is inflation-based rebates. So right now, Medicaid already gets these. So if the price of a drug increases by more than inflation in any given year, the drug maker has to pay back rebates to Medicaid beyond that inflation level. The idea here would be to extend those rebates to Medicare. And then the third group of things, and this is really only in the Democratic proposals so far, are proposals that would deal with the underlying high prices of these drugs, with Medicare negotiation being the most prominent example. And there's many different ways to do this. HR3 chooses to use international reference pricing, where exactly as you said in your introduction, we in the United States are paying much more than people in other countries for these same drugs. And HR3, following on President Trump's most favored nation, proposal in 2018, looks at that and says, we're going to try to use those lower prices abroad to get lower prices here. But it's not the only way to do so. And there's many other ways of creating a drug price negotiation system.
Okay. And so these proposals obviously face challenges, and this has been a hard problem to solve. I think one of the common concerns that's cited is related to the tension between policies that control drug prices and those that promote innovation and future R&D. And so, Ben, I want to turn to you and ask you to tell us a little bit about what the politics are of addressing drug prices in the US.
Sure. So I guess the way I think about this, or one of the ways I think about this, is that before we get to sort of the political side of things, there's sort of two buckets of people that we care about. Well, we care about everybody, but in this context, we can put people into sort of two big buckets. There's the one bucket of people where they happen to have a condition, or they're at risk for a condition for which there is a really good treatment, and that treatment is expensive, right? In that context, a high price is clearly a bad thing. Obviously, that means that it's harder to afford that drug, all the things that have already been talked about. Even if you can afford it, it makes you make trade-offs that you may or may not want. That's at an individual level and at, say, the federal government level, right? It may crowd out other priorities, whether it's school or taxes or infrastructure or whatever you like, right? So in that group, we say, well, high prices are clearly a bad thing. It would be great if we could lower them. The problem is that there's a second bucket of people where they have conditions, or they're at risk for conditions that don't have good treatments. And so for them, they're saying, wait a minute, don't set all the prices at zero. I want somebody to keep going after new cures for things that we haven't addressed yet. And so that's sort of the underlying tension before we even hit the political side of things. How do we balance those competing priorities? Because of course we don't really value one group over the other inherently more than the next. And so when you turn to the policy, you have to sort of tangle with this question. And we have some empirical evidence that can inform these kinds of decisions. What we know for sure is the direction of this effect. We know, for better or for worse, financial incentives are really important for the way that people behave in private markets when they make investments, right? There's a reason why when you look at clinical trial data, you see a lot of clinical trials for things like gout, and you see a lot less for things like malaria. And it's not because gout has a bigger welfare effect on the world. It's because people who have gout are richer than people who have malaria, right? And we also have empirical evidence that when Medicare first introduced prescription drug coverage, we saw manufacturers respond to that by increasing their activity. So it increased the market by something like 10–15%, and we saw clinical trials targeting that market go up 25+%. So we know the direction. The challenge is the magnitude, and that's really where the political discussion gets really complicated. We have some evidence, but markets change over time, so it's hard to apply evidence from the past. We know that policies change. Policies in many circumstances are not very explicit even about how exactly they would control prices, so it's hard to take that and sort of filter it through to the second stage and say, what does that mean for development incentives? We can at least ballpark what would happen, and we can identify some areas where these are probably more pronounced, these trade-offs. Early breakthrough therapies, or early stage investments focusing kind of first in class breakthrough stuff, that tends to be the kind of investment that comes from places like venture capital funds, that's mobile capital, and they really chase high returns. So we think those are probably a little bit more sensitive to higher end returns. We know that the effects of these trade-offs tend to grow over time, the trade-off that is, and that's just because these are long-term investments. We make a decision today, it takes a long time for that to bear out on the actual market, so it might be 10, 15 years before we understand the full effects. But even when we think about those kind of things, ultimately we're left with this reality where we're really confident in a direction of an effect. We're much less confident in exact magnitudes, and that magnitude is ultimately where a lot of the political discourse takes place.
Okay. I want to invite Rachel or Marianne, if you want to respond to anything that Ben said or vice versa, please feel free to jump in so we can have a conversation with this. Rachel, you look like.
Sure. And I think this innovation discussion is such an important one to have because Ben has already brought up a couple of the ways in which it's more complicated than it might be presented in the media. So we might agree, right, that at some point, if you really do reduce pharmaceutical revenues, there will be an impact on development incentives. But one of these key questions, just to put it a little more sharply, is what is the clinical value of those foregone drugs? And so if we're talking about some of these breakthrough drugs, which have new treatment options for patients who didn't previously have them, that's a different situation than if we're talking about a fifth drug in an already crowded class. And I think that's something we should be more open to talking about. I do want to quibble just a little bit with Ben's point about we know the direction, which is to say, we do know the direction of HR3, but it's not fair, I think, to take HR3 in isolation as a policy. So, one thing we should make sure we're doing is applying these analyses even-handedly. So when we created Medicare Part D, we gave seniors a pharmacy benefit they didn't have. The rhetoric is all about access. If you look at the CBO reports from the time, they don't talk about the idea that it's going to increase incentives to develop new drugs. They don't say it's going to lead to X number of new drugs. As Ben said, there's good economic evidence to show that it has. We're only asking this question when we would try to decrease drug prices. We don't try to model the increase in new drugs that we get when we expand insurance, either through Medicare Part D, which is specifically pharmaceutical in nature, or through the Affordable Care Act, right? If we give tens of millions of people a new healthcare benefit, we're going to increase their uptake of prescription drugs, and we're going to increase returns to the pharmaceutical industry. What's the impact of a law like that on innovation? So from a policy perspective, it's a bit concerning to me that we only ask this question in one direction. We don't ask it in the other direction because it makes it feel like there's an asymmetry to the policy, which I don't think is good for evidence-based policymaking in general.
And Rachel, I'd like to add one more layer to this conversation, which is whenever we're talking about, the expected revenue from these drugs, we are automatically thinking about the short and medium term after the drug is launched in the US market. But in truth, the biggest problem, if we compare our prices to prices that other countries pay, the biggest problem is not in the very first stages when the drug launches and it's initially in the US market. When we compare our prices to prices that other countries pay, the real problem is with drugs that already have been in the market for a long period of time, more than 10, 15 years. Everywhere else in the world, there's mechanisms that work over time to bring drug prices down. But in this country, what we see over time is drug prices always keeping going up and up and up. And that component of drug prices and spending is not necessarily foreseen by companies in the moment that they launch their drug. This is something that happens too much further on in the life cycle of the drug. So that's something that we do need, that's kind of a problem that we do need to take care of with our policy.
Great, thank you. One of the questions that has started to bubble to the surface is concerns related to equal access to drugs. And there's been some questions from the audience related to solutions in Medicaid populations. Maybe I'll start with you, Rachel, to ask what are some of those solutions, policy solutions to increase access to drugs for Medicaid populations? And I guess maybe I should preface this by giving the example of when the hepatitis C therapy came out, which is incredibly effective breakthrough medication. It was very hard for states to be able to pay for it for their populations that were insured by Medicaid.
And I think that framing is exactly right, because immediately when we're in the Medicaid context, patients' out-of-pocket costs are really tightly controlled by law. So we don't have the Medicare situation in which people are being asked to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket for a single prescription. So in Medicaid, we're really worried about the payer costs, the state and the federal government, rather than patients themselves. But exactly as you said, right, when Sovaldi came out, there was no question it was safe and effective. It was curative for most patients. This is exactly the type of drug that we want. It's a breakthrough. And it's a breakthrough for a drug that primarily treats a condition prevalent among disadvantaged Americans. We want more of these drugs. It was wonderful news. But because states are legally required to balance their budgets every year, we had a really hard financing problem that they were facing. They just could not afford to give the drug to all of the patients who needed it. That was a problem we really should have figured out how to solve. We really needed to get that drug to as many people as needed it. We're going to be facing a very similar problem soon in the context of the Alzheimer's drug that you mentioned, where states are going to need to pay for this, but it's certainly not curative. And there's questions about whether it has any clinical efficacy at all. And so it's going to present a very different situation than we had. But the reforms here are really not even on the list of things we've been talking about, right? So drug price negotiation could help, but part of what we may need is a rebalancing of incentives between the states and the federal government, or a way to think about, paying for drugs in some of these cases based on the value they provide to patients. But the Medicaid population, because of those factors, it's a different one. We don't have the out-of-pocket problem, and there's a particular state problem that has to be addressed.
The aducanumab example is a very recent one, and one that feels like that we're not quite through, haven't totally figured out what the takeaways are yet. But I'm going to ask anyway, what do you think we've learned from that example? So this is a drug that has questionable effectiveness if you read the varying debates about it, and is priced quite high for the drug, and then there's a lot of associated costs with taking the drug. Mariana, maybe I'll turn to you and say, what do you think we've learned based on the aducanumab experience?
I think we have multiple lessons that have been learned, but I'll highlight a couple. Lesson number one is, related to who gets to decide what drugs we can or should take. In the FDA approval process, everybody knows there has so much uncertainty, just like you mentioned, there's so much uncertainty about the actual effectiveness of this drug. While we know that there are safety concerns, those are clear. And so the FDA, basically, by letting this drug come into the market without placing boundaries or without, any other sort of constraint, and I will just explain this comment by saying that the particular trials that had aducanumab approved, that were presented as evidence for the approval, they included patients who had a very specific clinical profile. And the majority of patients with Alzheimer's out there in our population don't necessarily fit that profile that was presented in the clinical trials, it was included in the clinical trials. Not only the FDA approved the drug, but also approved to a broad population without placing any restrictions in who should take it, who would the drug would be indicated for. And so by doing so, there is one lesson about who gets to make that decision. Number one, if the FDA doesn't position themselves in the label or in just the mere approval of the drug in the market, then the next best option or the next option in the chain would be the plan the prescription drug plan in Medicare, the insurer in private insurance. And those decision makers have already, to some extent, taken positioning. For example, United Healthcare has said right now they're going to prevent taking a specific decision. They're going to wait for their Medicare Advantage population. They're going to wait on CMS approval and regulation. And other, payers are going to follow suit in making or not decisions. If the payer doesn't make the decision, then we're going to go further down the line to providers and patients. And it becomes, a question of how do we track down these decisions, and, who is ultimately going to be liable if something bad occurs to a patient, if one of those safety concerns is happening. So that's one of the lessons that we are learning as we go, and we are, following as this the utilization of this drug gets rolled out. But another aspect is really regarding the uncertainty around this drug. We do, as a society, in my opinion, we do want to have drugs available to all of us in certain situations, even before we can be 100% sure that they work. If it's lethal, if it's a highly lethal condition, and I have that, or my family member has that, I would like to have the chance to take this drug before we have a full knowledge and a full confidence that this drug works. But in terms of the Alzheimer's disease, the pathway for approval of these kinds of drugs, which is the accelerated approval pathway, it has been utilized for the first time for a drug where the biomarker of the drug is not necessarily connected to strong clinical evidence of strong clinical positive outcomes. And so there's also a question about how do we even reward drugs at this particular stage when we're not 100% sure they work? And would we want to be paying for these drugs at full price? Would we want to just, let them enter the market and be rewarded the same way as a drug for which we are fully confident that it works? So these are some types of questions that, we are going to definitely look back at this moment in time. And these are some of the questions that we're going to be learning from this.
Ben, do you want to weigh in on aducanumab?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's also sort of a confluence of a lot of things coming together that make it a particularly difficult situation. So one of the things that's unique about this, or not unique, but unusual, is that almost everyone's going to take this is on Medicare, right? So even though we have payment systems within the Medicare program, for example, where they rely on commercial market activity, well, that relies on this idea that there's a drug, and United Healthcare and Aetna and Cigna and all that, they're really worried about how much they're going to spend on it. And so they try and make it hard to get. They put it on a higher cost sharing tier. They really try and restrict use. They make you get prior authorization. They try and do all these things to control access to only the groups where they think there's going to be some benefit. And they use that to go back to the manufacturer and say, I'm not paying $56,000 a year. Well, when there's no one in the commercial market taking the drug, that creates a problem. And so this is sort of like a worst of all worlds thing. One of my pet peeves is that there's this idea that nobody negotiates for anything, and a drug manufacturer gets to set whatever price they want in the US market. Generally speaking, that's not true. This is actually as close as we get to that, though. And so in some ways, this is the most unique situation. And because it is approved through this unusual pathway, I think you could justify a lot more aggressive interventions, because part of what you're doing is saying, we don't really know how effective this thing is, so we're partially trying to figure that out before we have a permanent payment policy. And so I think you could justify a lot more than in your typical situation.
Great. Okay. Let's see. I want to turn to some questions about what some of the states are doing. And so there's been a bunch of different innovative activities in states related to trying to curb drug prices. And I wondered if maybe we'll go back to you, Rachel, and ask about tell us a little bit about what's going on in the states, and then speculate a little bit about how well those work. Do those mechanisms have teeth? Are they going to help rein in drug pricing?
Yeah, so on one level, there is certainly a lot going on in the state. So if you take a look, for people who are familiar with NASHB, they have a great legislative tracker where you can go and sort of sort by category the many different types of drug pricing reform efforts that are happening at the state level. And what's very interesting, or one thing that's very interesting about these, is that they are quite bipartisan in nature. So you've got states trying to create drug importation programs that include states like Vermont and Florida and Colorado, states of sort of different political persuasions, but you've even got states across the political spectrum introducing their own international reference pricing bills. Part of the concern here is that states don't have as much legal authority as the federal government does in some areas. And one of those obvious areas is Medicare, which is sort of a federal program. And so the federal government has more legal authority there. Another one is that the patent law is a federal law, and there are real questions about what states can do to regulate the prices of patented drugs. Happy to answer more questions about that if people are very interested in some old Federal Circuit case law, which I've spent too much time reading. But the point here is that states in a lot of ways the term is preempted from making some of these decisions, not all. And the pharmaceutical industry will certainly argue that the scope of preemption is larger than the states might like it to be. But there are ways in which the states are an important complement to the federal role. Both will need to act to make sure that the broadest population of patients is really benefited by reforms, but states can't do it on their own if the federal government won't act.
States can also do, I mean, it's worth noting, states are also doing other stuff related to drug pricing or drug access, maybe is the better point. So in Medicaid, we talked about hepatitis C. That's been sort of a somewhat famous example where, you know, as Rachel talked about, there's this problem of it's a curative therapy, and curative therapies are particularly problematic because you really want to get them out the door now, and that's a big budget hit. And so some states have experimented with, I think the terms are sometimes described in a little bit too flowery language, but they basically enter in, they get some credit from a manufacturer, and they say, hey, look, what if I go ahead and I'll only use your drug? So I'll promise you a bunch of volume. But in exchange, you're going to help me smooth out the costs of this over the next 5, 10, whatever years, right? That's an innovative payment policy. It's sort of a financing strategy, but it's a nice idea to try and think about how do we get this curative therapy out there under this constraint that we have, which is we've got to balance a budget. And so they're doing creative things on sort of on a budgeting financing side as well.
Yeah, I've heard the Medicaid program in Louisiana's payment of hepatitis C therapy called a Netflix subscription, where you just pay an annual rate, to a single company, and they get as many as they want.
And I would add, Rachel, on that point, even if states don't have the full solution, but at least understanding what they're doing shows us where the main problems are. And I think one good example, you just mentioned the subscription model, is one in which, why was that model needed? It was because, we had this one drug or one therapy, right? We needed that therapy. There's no other option that is as effective to treat and cure hepatitis C patients. So there's something that we cannot say no. Currently, Ben was saying we do have some negotiation mechanisms in the United States, and that's correct to some extent. Typically, our negotiation of prices for certain drugs, for every drug, typically it happens in exchange for volume and for formulary placement. So a pharmaceutical benefits manager is typically in charge of doing this on behalf of a plan or Medicare or Medicaid. The pharmaceutical benefit manager will say, okay, I'll put your product in my formulary, I'll give you volume if you give me a lower price. But for certain drugs and certain conditions, in Aduhelm, the Alzheimer drug is a good example, there's no way to put this drug against each other or against some other competitor in order to get a lower price because there's no competition. And hepatitis C were a similar situation. We had multiple agents, but we didn't have another class that was as effective. So innovative payment models, they show us that there are certain classes, certain categories of drugs for which the problem cannot be resolved using the tools that we currently have, or not as well accomplished, enough significant price reductions. And some ideas are the subscription model. Other ideas are simply what we saw in the COVID-19 response when the federal government negotiated with drug manufacturers for a fixed price. It's similar to the subscription, but it's for a limited quantity. In the subscription model, we say, I'll pay you a fixed amount and you cover as many patients as I need during this period of time. What the federal government did during the COVID-19 response was, I'll pay you a fixed quantity for this, antiviral or antibody if you provide me with a defined, I'll pay you a fixed amount if you provide me with a defined quantity. So we need more types of tools in our toolkit to be able to negotiate for different types of drugs as well.
So
I can also mention a different example, which is in Maryland. And so I'm currently in Maryland right now at Hopkins. So one example from us here in Maryland is the Prescription Drug Affordability Board. And the Prescription Drug Affordability Board's intent is to review prices of drugs that are branded, they're important, but for some reason they are very heavily weighing on the budget of the state health benefits program. And so the example from here, it shows us a tool to resolve a different type of problem, which is how do we increase transparency in drug prices today? Lack of transparency is a big one for patients because typically a patient who is required to pay a co-insurance, to pay a percentage of the drug price to get their drug, typically that patient will not benefit from the price that the insurer actually negotiated for the insurer side. So the patient is required to pay at the point of when the drug is dispensed. And that's too soon to learn the real price, the real net price of the drug. It gets calculated later on over time. So patients will typically be paying over very close to the list price, which is disconnected from the actual price negotiated by the insurer. So having something like HR3 that provides you with a benchmark from a maximum payable amount, or something like the Prescription Drug Affordability Boards, there are different solutions to try to disentangle this secrecy around what are the net prices, and leaving us only with what's out there as a list price, what's not known, which is the negotiated price. And so states are trying in HR3 and others in other bills are trying to give us other pricing points through which we can help elucidate that. And especially for patients, that's very important.
And so the lack of transparency limits competition in some ways. And so I want to ask a little bit more about the role of competition in drug pricing, in part because this is not a normal market. There's a protection through patents and other mechanisms for drug companies. And so I guess I'd like to hear you guys, your thoughts on how the role of competition in this market and pricing, and whether or not these kinds of exclusivities limit the competition in a way that affects prices.
So I might frame
ahead,
it just
Rachel.
a little bit differently, which is that you're absolutely right to say that there are patents and FDA exclusivity periods here. But that's true in a lot of markets. There's often patents or exclusivity periods, but there is something different here, which is that we often tell payers, and you are legally obligated to cover this drug. So it does create a sort of more complex situation that makes it not quite like a normal market. As Ben was mentioning, specifically in the context of Aduhelm, or aducanumab, right? There might be more reasons to be concerned that Medicare is going to kind of be held hostage, right, by the makers of this drug because of the way in which Part B is structured. Medicare can't say, no, we think this price is too high and we want to pay less, because they have to cover drugs that are reasonable and necessary. And the cost of the drug isn't part of that analysis to them. Now, there is this national coverage determination process, which we've been talking about, and we can continue to do so, but it's not a standard free market negotiation between the government and a pharmaceutical company, even taking into account the existence of patents and other exclusivity periods, because we tell Medicaid, you have to cover essentially all FDA approved drugs. We tell Medicare, you have to cover drugs that are reasonable and necessary. And we say that drugs that have FDA approval are reasonable and necessary. So putting those two things together means that negotiation that we do have is more limited than we might think it should be in some sense. Yeah,
I mean, I like that framing, because I do think that's one of the things that somehow gets like the drug market is somehow unique because there are patents and things like that. And it's like, well, that's not the unique feature. Everybody's got patents. I mean, Coca-Cola or whatever has patents, and we don't seem to have this discussion about that. And so it's not just that. I mean, I would back up. And one of the things that I think is really odd about this whole discussion is we're saying, well, the government's looking at this and saying, well, I'm worried about some of these prices. I got to do something about these prices on the back end. But what does the federal government also do? The federal government also subsidizes the purchase of all of this stuff on the front end. And then they come back later and they say, oh, geez, look at that. People aren't as cost conscious as I thought they might be. And it's like, well, God, so, one reasonable view of this is to say, or an alternative view perhaps is to say, well, wait a minute, another option here is to think about what's unique about this market. Is it the patents, or is it perhaps that part of what's going on is we have these coverage restrictions and rules, and we also are open-ended. We have these open-ended subsidies in, for example, the commercial market when you buy health insurance. Well, that depresses cost sensitivity for everyone, right? And that's not a drug issue. That's a hospital issue. That's a doctor issue. That's an everything issue. And so I would emphasize that point at least. The second point is, and I'm very nervous to talk about patents when Rachel's on this, but from a purely like theoretical standpoint, if you were to design like an optimal patent system, the answer might not be to give everything the same patent length, right? And in drugs, you might make the argument that what's the problem with patents in this market? Well, it might be that there's something about the way the kind of blunt patent system works that you can get an awful lot of patents that are hard to break in this market. And maybe we think that actually goes sort of longer than we intended when we made that patent process or something like that, right? So in some ways, it's not the patents per se that's unusual, but it might be the way that they interact with the drug market that might reasonably give you a sensible argument for saying, well, maybe we want to alter things a little bit.
But leaving the patent issue a little bit to the side, I want to just mention that there's two types of competition that way we have to consider. One type of competition is when we have direct competition. So we have a generic entering the market for a certain branded drug. So that's a direct competitor. And when I'm the patient, I go to the pharmacy with a prescription for that product. The pharmacy can help me figure out which one is the cheapest option, either because of my formulary or because of the prices that they paid, and they can directly substitute one thing for the other. So that's the kind of most direct type of competition that we have today in the US market. And historically, we've learned that this type of competition has been very successful in bringing down prices. Not only the prices of the new alternatives entering the market are down, but over time, they also put pressure on the price of the originator drug that tends to come down as well. So that's one type of competition. The other type of competition that we have is brand competition. So we have a therapeutic class, pharmaceutical industries, A, B, and C, each one launched their own product, their own branded product. The best example here is insulins. So we have, branded proprietary products from 3 different drug makers. And these 3 products, they are therapeutically very, very similar. One might even argue equivalent, but they're branded. So when the person comes to the pharmacy with a prescription for that drug, the pharmacist cannot easily substitute. Actually, they may not substitute without a specific new prescription from the provider. And because of that, one of the problems is there's no way for the patient to know at the point of care which one is the cheaper product. But in addition to that, the second layer is decisions from plans. They take advantage of drug rebates. So the price negotiation for these drugs, they occur in a way that is very concealed, at least to the general public and the patient when they go to the pharmacy. Price negotiations happen through drug rebates that will lower the price of the branded drug for that plan and patient. So maybe in my health plan, drug A will be cheaper, and in your health plan, drug B will be cheaper. So that kind of brand competition, because it depends on 1, rebates, and 2, it depends on a new prescription, it opens a can of worms of direct to consumer advertisement, the role of coupons and patient assistance programs that hook a person in one branded drug. And with what I think it's actually the main problem of this list is the fact that very often, if not always, the pharmaceutical benefit manager who is in charge of negotiating these prices and figuring out which of these branded products is the most convenient one, the cheapest one for me to have in my plan, oftentimes the pharmacy benefit manager is making a profit off of these price concessions that they negotiate. So that's a very strong and oftentimes distorted incentive as to what product gets covered, what product gets more favorably covered. We, in my research and we in the market, we have seen several examples of situations in which there would be a list of cheaper products, but because there's a profit being made on the price concessions negotiated on the most expensive option of that list, the most expensive gets treated more favorably, gets covered, whereas cheaper options are forgone for that coverage. So patients end up again paying the price, not because products are patented or prices are high, but because of a decision in terms of product selection that is made for them on their behalf by somebody who's profiting off that decision.
I was just going to follow that up a little bit. I mean, this conversation is sort of bringing up an issue that is an undercurrent throughout all of this, namely like how pricing works. And pricing is like really complicated. It's like very annoyingly complicated. And it's real, but it is important. It's important for even like thinking about the trade-off discussion, right? Like lowering price by X is going to do what to incentives to go after cures or whatever, right? It obviously that's going to, it's going to require questions about, well, lowering prices on what drugs, like Rachel was talking about, thinking about composition questions, but even lowering what price matters, right? What price and to whom are you lowering, right? Are you lowering the price that the hospital gets paid to administer that drug? Are you lowering the price that the patient pays out of pocket? That one's not going to be as important because that represents a small amount of the revenues associated with the drug. Are you lowering what the manufacturer actually gets coming through their door? That price is going to be more important for that kind of trade-off discussion. And so when we think about this complex pricing environment, one of the things that comes out of it is that it's kind of hard to predict what the sort of trade-offs and all sorts of effects of these policies are, in part because we're always talking about various different prices throughout the market. And so I just wanted to highlight that as one of the complexities here that sort of is an undercurrent, I think, to a lot of what we're talking about today.
And just sort of one other note about this, and maybe I or we feel this more acutely as people who are academics and researchers, but a lot of this information is also secret. And that makes it really hard to figure out what these numbers are and how we should design policy if we're sort of estimating what Medicaid net prices are, or trying to figure out spending by indication, which is often not reported in some of these databases. So different things are hard to figure out. And part of what's going on here is that industry does argue that these net prices that are paid to different payers are trade secrets. And so therefore they cannot be made public. There have been some advances on this front. So I apologize for not remembering exactly which of the stimulus bills it is that allows MedPAC and MacPAC to have information about actual net prices paid in Medicare and Medicaid, and hopefully that will inform their policy proposals going forward about how we should think about some of these questions. But my favorite example is, I think it was Pfizer sued Texas's HHS department for disclosing Medicaid prices to state lawmakers who were trying to exercise oversight over the state Medicaid program because those prices were trade secrets, they argued. So this is really a difficult issue, sort of that they're willing to sue over.
And I've seen that in my own research as well. When we talk to companies, the large plan sponsors, self-insured employers, they also are often not able to know exact prices that they are paying because of these contractual agreements and things like that. So when we have our population paying over prices that nobody else is paying because they are the list prices and everybody else is negotiating these prices down, but consumers who are the least able to make an informed decision because, the trade-offs across different drugs in the therapeutic class, what direct competitors exist, in all sorts of clinical aspects, in therapeutic aspects, not to mention direct to consumer advertisement, coupons. A patient who gets a coupon, I think one of the most egregious cases is a drug for which, if you take a coupon for this drug, you pay zero out of pocket. But to your insurer, the list price of this drug will be about $2,000 for a month of treatment. But if the person would go to the pharmacy to take the same drug as individual pills over the counter, would be about $20. So the lack of information distorts everything. And coupons, for example, patient assistance programs are not an example. So having the patient pay over list price, I think it's a very serious market distortion that we have right now. In introducing transparent prices such as HR3 or such as something negotiated by the Prescription Drug Affordability Board, introducing these pricing points would advance that the patient side of affordability in this market.
So question for you about PBMs. And Marianne, I'm actually going to ask you this, even though you just finished talking. Are there ways that we could think about regulating PBMs to make the rebates more transparent to consumers, or is there some policies that could be enacted that would improve the perverse incentives where PBMs profit and it drives the selection of preferred branded drugs?
Sure. So, helping identify these pricing points, we have already some price transparency mandates and disclosures. Right now, this year, we had from the hospital side. We are soon to get over the course of the years to just disclosure to other pharmacy benefits side. But having a sense of these actual paid prices is helpful. Also having a sense at, for example, in the Medicare program, I think it's a good example, increasing the ability to monitor and audit these choices, and requiring PBMs to actually use the lowest net price. A more radical proposal would be just getting rid of rebates altogether. And, if we think about a hospital, for example, the hospital is not allowed to send a check back to the insurer and say, hey, thank you for sending me 3 people to do a colonoscopy here. Here's a check for you for $500 for this volume of patients that you sent me. That's illegal in this country, but it is legal for the pharmaceutical manufacturer to send a check and say, hey, you paid for 3 units of Humira this month. Here is your rebate back. And, so that's one possibility. We could also have a market solution if more payers would be willing to change their contracts with the PBMs and say, no, I'm not paying you anymore a portion of my rebates. I'm only going to be paying you fixed fees. That's something we have worked a lot with self-insured employers to try to change that business model. But at the end of the day, there is an inertia that comes from the models that we currently have. And many employers are not willing to risk it. So that's the situations where we need some public policy to change, the business model that PBMs operate, for example, and having more transparency in how much are PBMs making off of every drug? How much are they keeping from these rebates and price concessions that they are being able to keep as revenue?
Great, thanks. I want to talk for a minute about the insulin market, if we could. We're only about 10 minutes left, but the insulin market obviously insulin has made headlines over the past couple of years with very high prices, which have tripled over the past decade. Often these new medications are very similar to what was initially produced decades ago, or maybe a century ago. And yet brand name insulin manufacturers have increased their prices to very high levels, and stories in the press about lives being lost because of these high prices. Could I ask you guys to talk a little bit about what's happening in the insulin market and what we've learned that could prevent something like that from happening again in the future? Rachel, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. So, I will defer to Mariana on some of the clinical questions here about the relationship of these products to each other or to some of the older products. But legally, certainly one thing going on is that people have growing, I'll say, antitrust concerns about the behavior of really the three companies that are in the market that are kind of behaving like an oligopoly. And so there's questions from an antitrust perspective about whether some of their pricing behavior rises to the level of a violation of the antitrust laws, and whether that might help in some of these to bring down prices. The other noteworthy development from a legal and policy perspective is that we do now have an interchangeable insulin biologic, which is the first interchangeable biosimilar approved under the pathway established by the Affordable Care Act to do so, now a decade ago. And so as we see that rolling out, certainly there is no shortage of discussion of the ways in which biosimilar rollout has not been as robust as people had hoped, either in the number of biosimilars or in their uptake by patients. But having an interchangeable biosimilar could change things, and it will be sort of worth watching if that does over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to speak too much to the clinical side of things, but I guess part of the challenge here is that insulin exists in sort of a gray area between what we call small molecules and biologics, I guess. And there was always a challenge of, is there really a generic or not in that market? And that's always been a challenge. But insulin, ironically, has been sort of the poster child for this list versus net pricing issue. And it's been one of the more frustrating elements of this whole portion of the market. Insulin list prices have gone up a lot. Insulin net prices have diverged from list prices as much in that market as we have seen anywhere else for branded drugs. Yet, for patients, because often the cost sharing can be a function of list prices, yet these huge out-of-pocket expenditures associated with insulin, that's part of what makes it so frustrating, is that you've got this drug where the insurer is paying this much lower price, and the patient, every January or whenever your policy renews, you suddenly have this huge out-of-pocket expenditure for your insulin. And so one of the challenges has been, this speaks to the PBM question, speaks to the insurer issue. Some people like Eli Lilly have offered new versions of the insulins with lower net prices and lower list prices, and nobody buys them. And so it's like one of the most frustrating elements of this whole pricing dynamic. The hope is that now that we have something more akin to a generic, that market is going to sort itself out. But it does, I think, just about every bill in Congress carves out insulin as sort of a special case where they say, look, we're just going to put a cap on how much you spend on insulin. And as much as I genuinely don't like one-off policy like that, in this case, I think you can make an argument to say, this has existed in a weird gray area for a long time that our policy has sort of missed in some sense. And so you can try and justify it that way. But that list to net pricing issue has not been any more stark than in the insulin market.
And that explains why affordability is such a big problem in this country, because affordability of insulins is an example of why even fully insured patients can have trouble affording their drug, because of this, what we already discussed, but also because it is perfectly legal and common to ask for patients to pay a percentage of the drug cost. Now, all of us are hopeful to see this change with interchangeable biosimilar coming into the market, because without that option, all the decisions would be made by your plan, represented by your PBM, who, by the way, is making a profit off of the rebates they are negotiating on your behalf. So, until then, we had a more top-down approach for decisions. Now, with an interchangeable product, we at least open up the possibility that at the pharmacy counter, the pharmacy can offer you a different product. Now, my research has showed, we ran an experiment with actual consumers, and we showed them advertisements for fictitious insulin. So it was fun to, create the products, et cetera. And we found out that if you needed a new prescription, patients were more hesitant to take the drug. So the fact that you can take this option without a new prescription, that also can change the patient side of things, the patient acceptability and even patient trust on how similar and how equivalent these different products are. And a third point is manufacturers, they are feeling the heat. They know that these policies are coming. They are responding to that pressure. One way that they're responding is ramping up their patient assistance programs, their coupons, and their, copay assistance. And that also brings distortions to the market oftentimes. One of the things that we've seen is for the insulin that now has a biosimilar, which is insulin glargine, for that preparation that has a biosimilar, affordability programs, coupons, and patient copay assistance are less generous. Patient assistance is more generous to the versions that are a little bit different and cannot be directly substituted by the biosimilar. So we're seeing all these, changes in the market. And again, from the patient side, is a little bit too much to expect that the patient will have the full knowledge of that. That's why agreeing to Ben, I also don't like these one-off policies, but in terms of specifically of insulins, I think it's helpful that we can use policy to change those distortions.
Great. All right, so we have just 4 minutes left. I want to ask each of you, I think you've all demonstrated incredibly well how complicated this is and that there's no easy solutions. And yet I'm going to ask you, if you could choose one policy change now that could be implemented immediately, which one would it be and why? So Rachel, I'll go back to you.
Great. So unfortunately, I'm going to give the law professor's answer, which is it depends on which problem you think is the biggest problem and which group of people you're prioritizing. So one potential hot take you could have here is that you could say expanding insurance to people who don't currently have insurance is a drug pricing policy idea because it solves their problem of access in a way that we worry about right now. So Medicaid expanding that nationwide would be really impactful for a lot of patients.
All right, we haven't talked about that, but thank you for that answer. Ben?
I guess I'll give maybe two. Another annoying answer. One of my biggest annoyances in life is that there are policies that sit on the floor of Congress that everyone agrees should be passed, and they don't pass them because they're useful for political leverage for other sorts of stuff. And everyone does it. It's not just one group at one time. So what I would say is, if I had two options, I would right now they have fix the Medicare prescription drug benefit just like today. Everyone is within, epsilon of each other politically in terms of sort of normal political negotiation. They are close enough. They could pass that tomorrow and just fix that and be done with it. And it would help address some of this list to net stuff and all that craziness. That would be great. If I were to back up, my biggest priority is maybe kind of along the lines of what Rachel's talking. I would say try and put this sort of general healthcare market on more of a budget. Get rid of some of these open-ended subsidies. Stop subsidizing employer insurance in the same way. It puts drug makers, it puts hospitals, it puts physicians, puts everybody under more normal pressures that exist in private markets.
Do you think that would impact innovation?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to have some effect. The question, of course, is going to be how everybody responds to that. I don't know the exact answer. It's going to depend, honestly, on how good do you think commercial insurers are at directing people basically towards higher value drugs or lower value drugs? In some cases, they seem to be reasonably good, really good at getting people onto generics, as an example. They're really good at trying to steer people when they have good brand-to-brand competition. How good you think they tend to be in some other circumstances, probably more debatable, but yeah, no question.
All right, Mariana.
Yeah, I think the options that we have on the table, I would just, be strongly in favor of implementing them, having the secretary negotiate prices, having prices be available to privately insured individuals as well. That would be a very strong policy. Ideally, using international drug prices. I know this is right now under debate, but borrowing from other countries strategies that they do have, short of implementing them here, for example, health technology assessment would be a good one, to control even, and provide options to negotiate launch prices. But those policies are very important, and they would substantially change our ability to negotiate moving forward.
All right, I have to say I have so many more questions, but unfortunately we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank you, the three of you, for joining us today. It's really been a great hour, and I have enjoyed very much talking to you. I also want to invite everybody to join us at our next virtual seminar, which will be on wealth building and building health, which is October 1st. We hope to see you then, and until then, have a good one.